Before we dive into tonight's haunting story, be sure to like and subscribe, or you may find yourself wondering if something is watching you. Hit that button if you dare.
The air in the abandoned hospital was thick with decay, a musty scent that clung to the walls like the remnants of forgotten lives. I stood at the entrance, staring at the broken glass doors that had once been a barrier to the outside world. Inside, the silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe echoing down the crumbling hallways. It wasn't just the decay that made this place eerie, it was the feeling that something, or someone, was still here. Something unseen, yet undeniably present. I had come here with my team to document the site. Abandoned hospitals were notorious for being haunted, the tragedies and misfortunes that occurred within their walls often leaving a lingering presence. It was just a job to us. We'd explored countless places before: mental asylums, prisons, old factories, but there was something about this one, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as soon as I stepped inside. The place had been shut down for over 2 decades, but the records told a different story. The original building had been constructed in the 1930s, and it had seen generations of doctors and nurses who had witnessed everything from childbirth to death, and perhaps something darker. Rumors of experiments and unethical treatments floated through the records like smoke, but we had no interest in those details. We were here for the thrills, the stories to share later. But soon, I realized those stories wouldn't be something to tell lightly. As we made our way down the dimly lit corridors, our footsteps echoed off the cracked tiles beneath our feet. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. We passed old patient rooms with rusted bed frames and torn curtains. It looked like time had been frozen in this place. Frozen, but not forgotten. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here. "Let's set up in the old ward," I suggested to my team, trying to shake off the unease that was slowly crawling up my spine. It's the most notorious part of the building. If we're going to get something good, it'll be there. We nodded and continued on, but with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The atmosphere in the hospital felt oppressive, as though the very walls were suffocating us. And then, as we entered the ward, something shifted. The air felt colder, and the flickering lights above us sputtered out, leaving us in near darkness. We turned on our flashlights, the beams of light cutting through the thick shadows, illuminating a room that seemed to swallow the light in return. There were beds here too, but they were no longer just beds. They were monuments to suffering. The sheets were tattered, and the walls were stained with what looked like years of neglect. In the far corner, a rusted metal trolley sat, its drawers half open, as if someone had abandoned it in a hurry. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, inspecting the remnants of what was once used for medical care. "What's that?" one of my team members asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I followed his gaze and saw something I hadn't noticed before: a small, worn diary lying open on the trolley. Its pages were yellowed with age, the ink fading, but the words were still legible. I bent down and carefully picked it up. The entry read, "March 16, 1943. The experiments are working. The patients are responding. Their suffering is what we expected. The transformation is slow, but I am certain it will be complete soon. They will be the future of medicine." I stopped reading, the weight of the words settling heavily in my chest. What kind of experiments had they conducted here? What had they done to the patients, to the people who were left in this hospital to die alone? I could almost feel their presence around me, the spirits of those forgotten, their pain still lingering in the very air. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath us. We all froze, our flashlights flickering as a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing our light. Panic set in as we fumbled to turn them back on. When the beams finally flickered back to life, we saw a figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't a person, it was something else. Something wrong. It was tall and hunched, with long, bony limbs that twisted unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but the silhouette of it was unmistakable. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air felt like it was closing in on us. I could hear my team breathing heavily, their fear palpable. "Get out!" I whispered, my voice trembling, but it was too late. The figure lunged at us, its limbs moving at impossible angles. I barely had time to react as it swiped at one of my team members, knocking him to the ground with a bone-crushing force. The others screamed, scrambling to escape, but the creature moved faster than any human could, In the chaos, I found myself alone in the hallway, the distant screams of my team echoing behind me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing: this hospital was far from abandoned. Whatever had been left behind in these halls had never truly left. The spirits of the patients, the ones who had suffered and died here, had not found peace, and something darker, something twisted, was still here. I ran as fast as I could, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't look back, didn't stop to check on the others. I just needed to get out. The door to the loading dock was just ahead, but as I reached for the handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The figure, the creature, had vanished. I stumbled through the door, barely managing to escape, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My mind was racing. What had I just witnessed? What was still inside that hospital? To this day, I can't explain what happened in that place. I've tried to forget, tried to tell myself it was a figment of my imagination. But the truth is, I'll never forget the hospital, the diary, or the thing that still haunts the halls, and I'll never return. Because some places are meant to be left undisturbed, some things are better left in the past. The wind howled through the trees as I approached the old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It had been years since it closed, but the rumors never died. People said it was haunted, that there was something dark in the walls, something that remained even after the building had been left to decay. But I wasn't scared. I'd explored enough old buildings to know that the real horror was the unknown, the things left behind when the doors closed. I wasn't there to investigate ghosts. I was there to document what remained. The hospital had been built in the 1930s, a towering building with Art Deco elements, designed to be the crown jewel of the city's medical infrastructure. But after decades of questionable medical practices, the facility was closed in the early 90s. Some whispered about unethical experiments, others about the terrifying number of deaths. The truth was buried deep within its walls, left to rot along with the building. I couldn't resist the pull. I entered through a broken side door, the lock rusted and useless. Inside, the halls were dark, the smell of mold and decayed heavy in the air. The walls were lined with faded paintings of smiling patients, their eyes hauntingly lifeless. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness, revealing long-abandoned rooms filled with medical equipment. Old gurneys, broken forestands, and yellowed files scattered across desks. The further I walked, the more unsettled I became. The building was still alive, in a way. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the distant dripping of water, the low hum of something hidden in the walls. It felt like the hospital was breathing, watching. I reached the old ward on the top floor, the one rumored to have been the site of the worst experiments. The air was colder here, and I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. The walls seemed to close in, the dim light barely able to cut through the thick atmosphere. Then, something caught my eye. A door, partially ajar, hidden behind a decaying curtain. The sign above it read, "Psychiatric Ward." I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me immediately, a mix of antiseptic and rot. The room inside was dim, the last remnants of light fading in through broken windows. I stepped in, and my foot hit something soft. I looked down to see old medical records, rotting away like everything else in the building. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a rusted steel door. There were no markings, nothing to indicate what it was or what it held. But the door looked different from the others. Something about it felt ... wrong. I walked over, my heart beating louder with every step. I reached out and touched the handle, pulling it down, slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment. Something told me not to go down there. But curiosity won. I took a step forward, feeling the air grow colder as I descended. The stairs were steep and narrow, the concrete slick with decades of moisture. With each step, I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, the silence deafening. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight flickered, and the faint echo of my footsteps became distorted in the narrow passage. I reached the bottom, and that's when I noticed it. A faint noise scraping, like nails on metal, coming from behind a wall. My breath caught in my throat. I moved toward the noise, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I reached the wall, feeling the coolness of the concrete. The scraping was louder now, more distinct. Something or someone was behind it. I pressed my hand against the wall, trying to listen closer. Suddenly, the wall shifted. I pulled back in shock as the concrete cracked, revealing a small room. It wasn't just an abandoned storage area like I had thought. The walls were covered in strange marking symbols I couldn't recognize. There were old medical instruments, but they weren't just for standard treatment. They were crude, twisted, as if designed for something far darker. And then I saw a tan old journal lying on a table. I grabbed it, flipping through the yellowed pages. The entries were written in a frantic, disjointed hand. They won't stop screaming. They're not human anymore. The patients, they're changing. The doctors, they don't care. They say it's for science. I can't take it anymore. My heart raced as I read on, each word more disturbing than the last. The journal detailed experiments that involved mind control, invasive surgeries, and work. But the worst part wasn't the medical horror. It was the fact that, in the last few pages, the handwriting became even more erratic. They are still here. They follow me. They whisper through the walls. They are waiting. Just then, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Low, guttural growl. I turned, flashlight scanning the room. And then I saw them, figures, lurking in the shadows. Tall, thin, with pale, stretched skin. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide open but unseeing. They didn't move, but I could feel their presence, like they were watching me. I bolted. I ran back up the stairs, my flashlight flickering uncontrollably. The walls seemed to close in, the door at the top of the stairs now completely gone. Panic set in as I pounded on the walls, my breath quickening. There was no way out. I was trapped in the bowels of the hospital, with the twisted souls of those who had died here. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the scraping sound, growing louder. Some say I was never meant to leave. That hospital was never just abandoned. It was a tomb, a holding place for the patients whose screams were buried in the walls. I don't know if I escaped, or if I'm still there, lost in the shadows, waiting for someone else to walk through those doors. The cold wind outside howled through the rusted bars of the broken windows, sending a chill down my spine as I pushed open the heavy hospital door. The once pristine building, a shining beacon of medical progress, had long since decayed into an eerie monument of neglect. Wellington Memorial, they called it a hospital built in the early 1900s to care for the sick, but the years had stripped it of its purpose. Now, all it held was decay, shadows, and whispers. I had come here with a single mission: to document the abandoned hospital. I wasn't afraid of ghosts or legends. After years of exploring other abandoned places, I had learned to shut out the fear. But as I stepped into the main lobby, I felt a creeping sensation at the back of my neck, a feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I clearly was. The reception desk was long gone, the wood rotting and covered in dust. Old wheelchairs lay abandoned in the corners, their leather seats cracked and peeling. The walls, once white, had yellowed and cracked, peeling paint flaking off like dead skin. But it was the quiet that unnerved me most. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of something waiting. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and began walking deeper into the hospital. I wasn't expecting much, just the typical decay I'd seen in countless other places. But as I walked past room after room, I noticed something odd. There were no signs of personal belongings left behind. No old photographs or personal items that were common in abandoned places. It was as if the hospital had been wiped clean. As I moved down the corridor, I came across the first set of doors marked intensive care. They were slightly ajar, and I pushed them open, stepping inside. The air inside was heavier, as though it had been trapped for years, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. But something was off. There was something else there. Something I couldn't place. It was as though the room itself was still alive, holding onto a memory. I walked deeper into the room, my footfalls muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The room was littered with broken, equipment-told monitors, and 4 stands lay discarded like forgotten relics. But then, I noticed something more chilling. The walls of the room were covered in scribbles. Not just any scribbles, but frantic, desperate scrawls, written in a shaky, hurried hand. I moved closer, my flashlight casting long shadows on the wall as I read the words. They were disturbing, fragmented. They won't stop screaming. The pain doesn't stop. I'm not alone. My heart began to race. I looked around, trying to make sense of the madness on the walls. But before I could focus on any one thing, I heard it. It was faint at first, like the wind, but then it grew louder. Help me. The voice was clear now, and it sent a cold shiver through my body. I froze. The voice sounded human weak, desperate. There was no one there. The room was empty. My breath quickened as I spun around, my eyes scanning the room, looking for the source. But there was nothing. I backed up, the sound growing louder, clearer, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the hospital. The whisper was turning into something else, a cry, a moan of anguish. Something had been trapped here for far too long. I ran down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I moved, desperate to find the source of the sound. The hospital seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its dark corridors twisting like a maze. Then I saw another set of doors, this one marked basement. I didn't want to go down there, but the sound, the whispers, the pleading was coming from below. With every step, the air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. The basement was never part of the hospital's original blueprint. It was something added later, a dark afterthought. I had to see what was down there. I pushed open the heavy basement door, the rusted hinges screeching in protest. The stairs were narrow, slick with mold, and led down into a thick darkness. My flashlight flickered as I descended, the beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. The air was stale, damp, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long hallway stretching out before me. The walls here were covered in black mold, the faint smell of rot seeping into my lungs. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the hall, there was a light flickering. I took a tentative step forward, the floor creaking beneath my weight. As I neared the light, I realized it was coming from a small room at the end of the hall. My heart began to beat faster. Something was in there, something that didn't belong. I reached the door, and as I pushed it open, the air seemed to leave my lungs. The room was filled with old hospital beds, rows of them, each one covered in tattered sheets stained dark with what I could only assume was blood. But it wasn't the beds that horrified me, it was the walls. The same scribbles, the same desperate messages, but this time, they weren't just on the walls. They were etched into the skin of the people lying in the beds. The patients, if they could still be called that, were twisted, their bodies contorted and covered in sores. Their eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. Some of them were still breathing, but just barely. Their mouths moved, mouthing the same words over and over. "Help me." I stumbled backward, horrified, my flashlight shaking in my hands. These weren't just patients. These were the forgotten souls, the ones the hospital had abandoned, left to rot in the dark corners of the building. And now they were reaching out to me, begging me for something I couldn't give. The door slammed shut behind me, and I turned to run. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers, the cries, the screams, they followed me, louder now, echoing in my ears. The hospital wasn't abandoned, it was a prison, and I was never meant to leave. The old hospital loomed in the distance, its towering structure barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the earth like a living thing. I had heard the rumors about it. Of course, everyone had. The abandoned St. Catherine's Hospital, once a place of hope for the sick and broken, had been shut down abruptly in the early 1980s. They said it was due to financial problems, but I knew better. Everyone who lived nearby knew there was something darker behind its closure, something no one wanted to talk about. I had spent months researching the hospital, going through old files, newspapers, and even interviewing people who had worked there. But the more I dug, the more I realized how much was left hidden. It was like they were trying to erase it from history, but I wasn't afraid. I was a journalist, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how disturbing. As I approached the main entrance, I noticed the rusted chain that still dangled from the gate. The place had been abandoned for years, yet the gate seemed to be deliberately left in place, as if they didn't want anyone getting in. I paused for a moment, staring at the words St. Catherine's still faintly visible above the entrance, now covered in grime and rot. I pushed the gate open, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. The air was thick with mildew and decay, the smell so pungent it made my stomach turn. But I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. I had to see for myself. Inside, the hospital was a maze of darkness and rot. The main lobby was once grand, with high ceilings and a polished marble floor, but now it was cracked, covered in dust, and littered with broken furniture. I made my way down the hall, flashlight in hand, illuminating the corridors ahead. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, and doors stood ajar, revealing rooms frozen in time. An old examination room with rusted equipment. A maternity ward with cribs still standing empty. But it was the smell that disturbed me the most. Something far worse than just the scent of rot. It was a smell of something deeper. something that seemed to have soaked into the very bones of the building. I wandered deeper into the hospital, my footsteps echoing off the walls. There were no signs of recent human activity, no signs of squatters or vandals, which I found odd. But it was the silence that unsettled me. No distant traffic noise, no birds outside, just a suffocating quiet. I finally reached the basement. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped. The chill seeped into my bones, making my breath visible in the cold air. I could hear faint noises from below, like scratching or scuffling, but I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. At the bottom of the stairs, I found what I was looking for. The morgue. The heavy metal door creaked as I pushed it open, and the stench hit me immediately. It was so overpowering I almost gagged. Inside, there were rows of old metal gurneys, the kind used to store bodies before they were identified, or some of the drawers were half open, their contents long gone, but others were sealed shut. I moved to one of the open drawers, shining my flashlight inside. What I saw made my heart stop. A body. Not decayed like I expected, but preserved. Its face was contorted in a look of sheer terror, eyes wide open. It looked almost like it had been recently placed there, still fresh, like it was just waiting to be discovered. I stepped back in shock, feeling the blood drain from my face. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping even further. I felt a presence, something watching me from the shadows. My heartbeat quickened as I turned, scanning the room with my flashlight. That's when I saw them rows of bodies, dozens of them, all stored in the morgue. But something was different about them. They weren't the usual lifeless figures I'd seen in morgues before. They seemed almost alive, their skin pale, but not They were preserved, but not in a way that made sense. It looked as though they had been kept here, frozen in time, waiting for something. I turned and fled. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran up the stairs, the sound of something moving behind me, following. The scratching noise I had heard earlier grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was down there was coming after me. I couldn't look back, not until I reached the main floor. I burst through the lobby and out the door, not stopping until I was safely back at my car. But as I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm my breath, I saw something in the rearview mirror just for a split second. A figure, a woman, her face pale and lifeless, eyes wide open, staring at me through the cracked window. I swerved, nearly crashing, but when I glanced back, she was gone. The truth about St. Catherine's Hospital wasn't just about bad medical practices or the death of patients. It was much worse. Something had been done here. Something dark. The patients, the ones who died, maybe they were the lucky one. Those who were kept in the morgue, preserved like trophies, were they experiments? Were they victims of something far more sinister than I had imagined? I didn't know the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. All I knew was that I couldn't shake the feeling that St. Catherine's Hospital hadn't just been abandoned. It had been left behind. Left for a reason. And whatever had happened there was far from over. It was supposed to be a routine investigation, a story, a piece of history. I had spent years covering abandoned places, forgotten landmarks, the kind of places people only whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Abandoned hospitals, especially the older ones, fascinated me. They held the ghostly remnants of lives once lived, hopes once promised. But none had drawn me in quite like the story of St. Joseph's Morgue. Located on the edge of town, St. Joseph's was the type of hospital that had seen it all. Built in the early 1900s, it was renowned in its time for its advanced medical treatments, until its sudden closure in the 1970s. Rumors circulated for decades about the dark history of the place patients who mysteriously vanished, experimental treatments that crossed ethical lines, and the strange, unexplained deaths that occurred during its final years. The hospital had been sealed off after the last patient was moved out, left to decay like an old, forgotten book, gathering dust. But my curiosity got the best of me. I needed to know what really happened there. I needed to understand why it had been abandoned so quickly, why no one talked about it anymore. So, I set out with my camera, my notepad, and my nerves tightly wound. The rusted gates groaned in protest as I pried them open. The building itself was far more imposing than I had imagined, its Gothic architecture towering over me. The windows were covered in grime, casting the entire building in a dim, suffocating shadow. The air smelled stale, like old medicine and dust. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before stepping inside. The lobby was just as I expected, grand. Marble floors, cracked and chipped. High ceilings, peeling paint. A once gleaming reception desk, now covered in layers of dust. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, dark and foreboding, with no signs of life. The silence was deafening. Not a sound, except the distant creaks of the building settling and the occasional drip of water. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife, casting long shadows on the walls. I knew there were stories to find here. I could feel them in my bones, the whispers of the past calling out from the walls. But it wasn't until I ventured deeper into the hospital that I began to feel like I was being watched. Every step I took, the feeling grew stronger. There was something off about this place, something that didn't feel right. The first room I entered was the old operating theater. I almost froze in place when I saw it the operating table, still in the center of the room, surrounded by rusted medical instruments. The smell of antiseptic still clung to the air, as though it had been used just yesterday. But it was the blood stains on the floor that made my stomach churn. They were old, dried, but still visible. There were other stains too, darker, deep. I shook my head, trying to focus on my mission. I had to stay objective. I had to document the truth. But then, I heard it. A sound that stopped me dead in my tracks, a soft, muffled scream. It was distant, faint, but unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat. I wasn't alone. I followed the sound down the hall. My footsteps now hurried. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the hospital. The further I went, the darker the place became, as though the shadows themselves were closing in around me. The walls seemed to narrow, the hallways stretching endlessly in all directions. I entered what I assumed was the psychiatric ward. The room was small, cramped, with peeling paint on the walls and broken windows. But what caught my attention were the shackles old rusted bolted to the walls, the kind used for restraining patients. There were dozens of them, each one still in place, each one a reminder of the dark history of this place. But it wasn't the shackles that made my blood run cold. It was the whispering, the soft murmur of voices, low, faint, like a chant coming from the very walls themselves. I couldn't stay here much longer. I needed to leave, but as I turned to go, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. A woman. Her white hospital gown was torn, bloodied, her hair matted against her face. She didn't move, just stared at me, her eyes wide open, empty, like she was waiting for me to come closer. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from hers. Something about her was wrong. Something about her was wrong on a level I couldn't comprehend. She didn't look human, not fully. Her skin was stretched too tight, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she vanished. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I turned, running down the hallway, not caring where I went. I just had to get out. But the hospital seemed to shift as I ran. The doors I had passed earlier were gone. The hallways twisted and changed, becoming a maze that I couldn't escape. It was like the building itself had come alive, trapping me inside, playing tricks on my mind. I stumbled into what I thought was the front lobby, but when I looked around, I saw it was only a mirror image of where I had started. The walls, the windows, the tables, they were all the same, as if time itself had folded in on itself. The whispers became screams. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. My flashlight flickered, then went out. The darkness engulfed me, swallowing everything in sight. I don't know how I made it out of there. The last thing I remember was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my feet slapping against the pavement outside. I was free, but I couldn't forget the faces, the figures I saw, the whispers that still echoed in my mind. They had been waiting for me, for someone to uncover their secrets, and I had uncovered far more than I ever intended to. St. Joseph's Hospital wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. Forgotten for a reason. And whatever haunted those halls was still there, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to step inside. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, do you want to forget to share this video with them? Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video if you dare.